You're listening to the Today's Wills and Probate podcast, one of the leading sources of information for the wills and probate sector. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todayswillsandprobate.co.uk and follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Wills and Probate podcast. Today the podcast goes transcontinental. We have Tim Hewson, co-founder and CEO of LegalWills. Tim, a Brit born over here, but now lives in Ottawa in Canada. And the discussion today is about the development of legal wills, the law in the different jurisdictions that Tim covers, and the rise of technology, the adoption of technology across the wills and probate sector. So, Tim, it's great to have you on the podcast. Thank you very much indeed for joining.
Well, thank you, David, for inviting me. I'm looking forward to it. For
the uninitiated, perhaps you might start by telling us about LegalWills. Who is it? What is it all about? And a bit about yourself as well, because you, as I said, you're Brit, but have been in Canada for a number of years now.
I have. So, yep, I'm originally from the southeast and a little bit in the southwest. I did university in Loughborough University, and then came out to Canada to work for a high-tech company the late 90s into 2000. And the germination of LegalWills was we used to go out after work drinks every Friday, and then one time we went out and there were about 14 people sitting around the table having drinks, and one person commented that, you know what, I really need to get a will written. And we went around the table at that time, and we were all professionals. Some had children, we all had decent jobs at the time, some were homeowners. We were all family people, and we went around the table, and not one of those 14 people around the table had a will. And this was at a time back in 2000, 2001. It was the dot-com boom. And whenever somebody saw a problem at that time, I guess it may be similar now, but everyone's thoughts start to fire. It's like, what is that? That is a real problem. It's not necessarily a cost issue, but for some reason, we all knew writing a will was really important. It was important for our families, but not one single person around the table had got it done. So myself and my colleague at the time, we thought that there must be an easier way, not necessarily to make it cheaper, but to make it more convenient. Just remove those barriers, find out why people weren't doing it and what we could do to make it easier. Neither myself nor my co-founder had a legal background at that time, but we had a need. We had a need to prepare our own wills as well. So we met with some lawyers. Many said, can't be done. And eventually we found some lawyers who said, yeah, this is a need. We've got to harness technology and see if we can remove the barriers to writing a will. So that's really where it started. And that was back in 2001 that we launched LegalWills in Canada, legalwills.ca. And then shortly thereafter, a few years after that, when we really got Canada down, we then launched in the US with uslegalwills.com. The same year, we launched in the UK with legalwills.co.uk. Then in Canada, we actually went into Quebec as a province. Quite a long time after the rest of Canada, Quebec, and we can talk about jurisdictional differences, but Quebec was a really thorny one for us, but we got there eventually. And then just last year, we actually launched a service in South Africa as well. So that's the scope of our jurisdictions that we cover. And that's really how we've evolved over now 22 years.
And when you started out, was it always the intention for it to be a tech business, or was it that it was more around the wills at that point in time, for example?
So really, to be honest, it wasn't necessarily just wills. In fact, the first website we launched was all about getting your affairs in order. And that could be describing the kind of funeral you would want to receive. And we also had this service at the time that allowed you to write messages to loved ones that were then distributed after you died. And there were a few different services at that time offering that kind of thing, like the proverbial like sealed envelope that you wanted your loved ones to have. Don't open this until or unless I pass away. And we also had a service that would allow you to create your own personal homepage that would stay on the internet forever. So it was all around different death care things. But what ended up happening was the wills was clearly the service that everybody was looking for. So we spun off into LegalWills and just focused on the wills business. And the other ones still exist. And a number of different services tried to crack those different issues around communicating, but not wanting people to read the message unless it was the appropriate time to do that. So we actually spun off the wills service and just focused on wills at that point. And whether it's tech or whether it's a legal thing is an interesting question. Definitely a tech solution, but we do feel that we're doing more than tech. We've almost feel like we're in the education business as well now.
It's difficult to imagine life before the iPhone, but 2001 is pre-iPhone, isn't it? What was the internet landscape like at that point? What kind of demand was there for this sort of service?
Well, immediately we're launching a service that says, okay, type in all of your personal details. And that was like the first question. And what kind of, what's your children's names and what their birth dates, and asking personal questions like, who do you want to receive all of your personal effects? And so it was before its time, quite frankly. And if you look at the evolution of our service, the first few years, we were before the market was ready. And then a few things happened as we evolved. One of them, particularly in North America, was tax software, where people could file their taxes online. That came about in the late 2007, 8, I'm guessing around that area. So people became more comfortable with even entering information online that was considered to be personal. And then that helped a little bit take away that fear of the machine. But it was slow initially, and we've grown every year since, partly because, yes, we've grown the service, but yes, comfort levels with working with an online service has definitely changed between 2001 and 2024.
We're going to talk about geographic differences and jurisdictional differences in a second, but was it the case that the business developed geographically, or has it always kind of covered the whole of Canada for the sake of argument?
We did cover all of Canada initially. We created a service that would work across Canada. And then when we launched in the US, we didn't really want to launch until all of the states were ready. Partly because it makes it difficult from a business development perspective, and also from a customer service perspective. It's like, oh, you're in Idaho, we support Ohio, we don't do it. It's just difficult. You really got to launch across the country. We still don't. Weirdly, in the US, we do all of the US states except for Louisiana. In Canada, we only started to support Quebec 3 years ago, and it's language, but also Napoleonic code compared to common law. It's just different and difficult, and we also have to support the product as well and understand the differences. But we did launch across all of Canada except Quebec, and all of the US except for Louisiana, and even in the UK. We do England and Wales. We don't do Scotland. You can probably answer this better than I can, but we get a number of people like Channel Islands, Isle of Man. Do you cover us here? And it's still a thorny one for us, and we tend to avoid those.
I know, chatting to a couple of businesses that have looked at the US, that one of their biggest challenges is that the federal system that they have over there, you've got the overarching government, but then obviously each individual state has its own ability to implement legislation as well. What challenges that present specifically? I mean, presumably Louisiana is one of those case in points, is it, where it's just so wildly different from your existing structures that it would be a lot of work to make it work for Louisiana without that kind of reward.
Yeah, so that's the key. It's always a business case. Do we have the business case to launch in Louisiana? Can we do without it? If you're launching to 49 states with fairly similar legislation, then yes, the business case is there. And to do that one-off makes it difficult. In fact, when we did Quebec, it was primarily because businesses wanted coverage across Canada. So we're like, we have a hole. We have to plug that hole. It's not necessarily that we're now supporting Quebec. It's the fact that we can say we now support all of Canada with no exceptions. So that's really the business case. But the challenge for us is in the US and the state-specific laws is just keeping up with the legislative changes that happen. And even in our time, it used to be like every state required signing with 2 witnesses, except for Maine. Was it Maine or Vermont? One of those New England, that I think it might be Vermont, who needed 3 witnesses. It's like, really? Okay, so now we changed the help text, changed the service a little bit for that one state that has that weird, quirky law. But then, lo and behold, they changed that law. It went from 3 to 2. Well, you've got to be watching all of these states to see where the law changes. Not so much with wills. They're fairly consistent, but you get into advanced directives, living wills, medical assistance in dying, assisted suicide, things like that, which is so dynamic. The law is changing. And I know that in the UK, there's a lot of discussion now about assisted suicide and the 2 sides of the argument and what's going to happen with the law there. And it's happened in Canada as well. It's a very, very fast moving law. Now, look at that. That's very state and provincially specific. So watch that across 49 different states to see how the law changes. It's difficult to keep up with. And not only developing the service, but calling into our support team. Said, I'm in Oklahoma. What's the assisted, medical assistance in dying law in Oklahoma? Well, it's tough.
Are there rules of intestacy in Canada and the US?
Yeah.
And are they similar to the UK?
Well, they're all nuanced. And actually, so I think there are 2 provinces in Canada that are the same as each other. Everybody else is slightly different. I think one key difference is common law relationships. Some respect a common law relationship as a married relationship. Others do not. You'd have to know, and I think most people don't, and most people make bad assumptions about what they think might happen. And you can certainly be in some jurisdictions where you live with a partner for 20 years, die without a will, and they're out of luck. What we did find actually over the years is same-sex marriages. That did happen during our lifespan as a company. So that changed, but definitely intestate laws do vary and do change.
And how does that impact your tech stack and the development that you do there? I mean, do you have to change things specifically for each state, or is it a kind of fairly formulaic process for most people that then there's something sort of bespoke at the end of that journey?
We don't really want to be supporting 100 streams of code. We can't do that. So we have to make as much of the code consistent across all of the jurisdictions as we can. But with obviously the final document is different for every jurisdiction. Financial power of attorney is another one that is different, or lasting power of attorney in the UK, which we actually don't support a lasting power of attorney in the UK. But the end document is different for every state and every province, so that is different. But we try and maintain a core piece of code that takes people through the service, but it does change for each jurisdiction.
Big criticism in the UK is that we're still governed by a piece of legislation that was enacted in 1837, which for the US and Canada is ancient history. given how young those
Canada
places
was
are.
founded in 1867. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely nuts, isn't it? So, we're still governed by the fact that you have to be in the presence of two witnesses, and some fairly sort of archaic legislation. Is it the case that Canada and the US have adopted, more technology? Have they got digital signatures, for example? Are they using digital services as part of this process?
Canada law is fundamentally based on that same 1837 legislation. But what happened was that some things did change, and particularly COVID inspired, so everything remained static for 185 years. And then COVID happened, and it needed to happen. It really desperately needed. And we are a tech company. And when we founded the company back in 2001, we thought signing a document online and signing specifically a will online was going to be the de facto mechanism for signing a document. And it has to some extent. We have DocuSign. You can sign a contract online, but it always had wills and powers of attorney as an exception to that legislation. So what happened during COVID? Two things. One, the remote witnessing laws were enacted, emergency legislation across all jurisdictions, pretty much, temporarily. They all said it was you could remotely sign a document for up until August next year, and then it was extended again, and then it was extended again. And then 2 months, the UK rescinded it, right? 2 months ago. They said no more remote signing of wills. A lot of Canadian provinces continue with that remote signing, although some of them put in some stipulations. So again, it's a provincially specific change where some require one of the witnesses to be a licensed legal professional. So as long as one of the witnesses is a licensed legal professional, you can remotely sign the document. In Ontario, you can remotely notarize the document. So this is different for different jurisdictions. But the other thing that happened was that electronic signing of documents, aside from the remote witnessing, you could electronically sign and electronically store your documents in Canada, in British Columbia. You can do that now. That law has passed, and that law is in effect. It's not temporary, it's there. And in the US, Nevada, Utah, and a couple of other states have now passed that legislation as well. So you can electronically sign the document and electronically store it to be retrieved by your executor from the cloud when they need it. Unbelievable that it takes a pandemic to kickstart that, and unbelievable that other jurisdictions are still reluctant to embrace that as a technology, because the argument is always going to be protecting against fraud or coercion or somebody off camera. But to be honest, it's so much more difficult to fraudulently digitally sign a document than it is to fraudulently ink sign a document. So that reluctance to embrace the technology doesn't hold water.
You've talked about the impact that COVID had on legislation. And yeah, you're right. I think it's a source of enormous frustration over here about digital signing, with the caveat that you identify that, we have to protect the end user. What impact did it have on your business? I mean, you're covering 2 or 3 sizable jurisdictions, each of which were as heavily impacted by COVID, each of which had a very different approach to the control of it as well. How did it kind of impact what you were doing?
I think we sometimes forget maybe what that initial fear was. There was a pandemic coming out of Asia that was killing people quite dramatically. And I remember early signs when they were showing coverage of like villages in Italy that just looked like war zones. It was a situation where people thought we could legitimately all die here. It definitely made people more aware of their mortality, and it was very much unknown at that point. The second step is we couldn't meet with other people. We couldn't get together with anybody. Offices closed down, law firms closed down. So it was actually ended up being a perfect storm for us as a company who had been around at that point for 18 years. So we'd already established ourselves as a credible option. It's interesting because there were other will writing services that came into the market around that time, and they couldn't believe it was like Christmas and Easter for them from day one. It was a situation where people were concerned about their mortality. They were looking for an online option to prepare their will because they couldn't go to a lawyer. And it just was within the 1 month from this could be a concern to people realizing, okay, it is a concern. I need to get my affairs in order. I need to look for an online option. We spiked. There was one particular day where we were doing wills, like many hundreds of wills an hour at that point. It was craziness. So it was a perfect storm for us. People came to our service. I've never really seen a study of what happened to law firms during that time, because what I also found is that a lot of law firms weren't adjusting very well. They weren't offering many different options for people. They were saying you can't come to the office, but then what? There really weren't many other options for preparing a will other than going to an online service.
How did you manage that spike, that uplift with your customer service team? I mean, I know, for example, you're a remote business anyway. So, I mean, I'm assuming that it didn't have a massive impact on your ability to work, but presumably it had a big impact on your capacity.
It did, but then we shifted a little bit to all hands supporting people rather than developing new features and services at that point. Everybody is now helping people to get their wills written. And that idea we had for a super cool feature, we can put that on the back burner for now. It's actually quite difficult to hire people. Like, we couldn't suddenly get 6 new people in for that week or that month. We need to onboard a team. It takes a while to onboard people into our customer support team. And so it was very much the team that we have is going to make sure that we can support the need that's there right now. And everything else was put to one side. So we managed. And it may be that some people who were used to getting through to a live agent at any time may have to leave a message and we're going to call them back. It may not have been up to our typical standards, but it was the middle of COVID. I don't think. How was the bank doing when you called them? Like we were doing well.
Having been around since 2001, then I suspect that you've seen quite a bit of change in the industry over that time. What are the key trends? What are the things that you've seen happen between then and now? I mean, we talked about the fact that there wasn't even the iPhone at that point, which is quite astonishing, isn't it? I mean, we've got an awful lot of digitization happening in this space. We've talked before about digital vaults and digital storage, that kind of thing. Do you just see that accelerating?
So I would say, I think one of the disappointments over the 23 years has been the lack of real technical innovation. We've certainly tried to move things along on our side, but many of our solutions require legislative change, and some of it requires lobbying. And we're in an industry that's traditionally slow to adopt technology. There's no doubt. There's often discussion about why it won't work, why something is a bad idea, and not necessarily a discussion about why something is a great idea. And I think digital storage of documents is, or specifically wills, is one where you can talk about why it might not be a great idea, but signing in ink on a piece of paper and storing that for 40 years cannot be the best solution that we have in 2024. And one of the reasons why BC did adopt or were more open to adopting that change was because they did have a number of natural disasters in BC. They had forest fires, they had floods and a lot of weather events that were going on there. And weather events is something that is definitely we're going to see more of. So what happens is that people can perish in these natural disasters. And that piece of paper that described everything that they wanted to do with all of their life savings and their estate, that's gone with them in a flood. It's just not a very doable thing. And yes, you can store it in a central storage facility, but many people don't. Many people write their will and store it at home. So it makes far more sense. Not to mention, even without that, the number of people who come to us and say, my father had a will, he's died, we don't know where the will is. It's just not a very, like, if we were to sit down and come up with a solution in 2024, that would not be it. Write it on a piece of paper and keep it somewhere safe. So what we found, if anything, is that the adoption of technology is slow. However, the other thing that we have found over the 20 years is we were pioneers, but we found a number of more mainstream services coming online, and that's helped online will writing in general. In the US, there's a company called Trust and Will, obviously Fair Will. In the UK, they've made it more accessible. So they've changed, I think, the narrative away from, you've written your will, why should we be worried? Are you ill? No, I've written my will because I'm doing an adult thing to do, where everybody should be writing their will. And it doesn't mean that I'm contemplating death or I'm suddenly feeling fragile about myself. It's a piece of responsible financial planning. So we've managed to see a number of online services that have helped us to change the narrative around write your will when you're young, update it throughout your life, circumstances change, and you're going to save your loved ones a real headache compared to not having a will. So that has changed, and I'm actually quite happy to see a lot of these online services come on board, because we're not the only ones shouting in a big vacuum. There's a number of us trying to convince the population that it's a good idea. But I think, having said that, the 20 years of real slow progress, we are really on the cusp of something big. And, obviously AI, artificial intelligence, is absolutely going to change our business, and it's going to change the industry in general. In my years, I've never seen anything that blows my mind so frequently. Like, it's almost like a month doesn't go by where I don't see an advance in AI where I don't say, wow. We know that right now, AI it's a common cliche now, but today it's as bad as it's ever going to be moving forward. It's just going to get better and better and better. We've already adopted AI chat as a support tool, which is like, the most basic capability of AI. But we've trained it. We trained it with every support ticket that we've answered over the last 20 years. Plus, we went in all of our FAQs, everything. So it's our LegalWills AI chat. And 75% of the time it's good. 20% of the time it's amazing, better than we could do. And then 5% of the time it's just awful. And I don't know what it's thinking. So those 5% of the awfuls, they will be eliminated. But I think that we've all got to, as an industry, think about how AI is going to impact us. And our service is fundamentally an interaction tool to prepare a document. You answer a series of questions and we're going to give you that document back. So it's not that much of a stretch to think, well, AI could probably do what you do. But I think the next step beyond that is, any solicitor is asking people to fill out a form in the lobby, and then they go in the back and complete some software to generate a will for that client. They're not going to be able to charge £400 for that anymore. So AI is going to be changing that level of interaction with a client. But there may be a role for very sophisticated, highly experienced legal advisors, absolutely. But the commodity will writing, that's going to change for sure. So we're going to see a real evolution in that area in both our industry and estate planning in general.
I'm with you. I don't seem to be able to go more than a few days without hearing about the impact that artificial intelligence will have, not just on will writing, but our life in general. I mean, prior to the recording, we were chatting about using something like Microsoft Word to dictate more of our material. So whether it's a blog or an article or whatever it might be. And I realize that there's not a huge amount of AI in that, but you could easily see how it could augment what you're doing to improve it ultimately.
Yeah.
We could probably talk about a lot of the differences between the different jurisdictions that you're in and some of the legal challenges that you face, as well as the tech challenges for most of the rest of the day, Tim. It's knocking on for late afternoon here, and goodness knows what time it is with you in Canada. So I'll let you get away. But I really, really appreciate you joining the podcast. Thank you very much indeed.
Oh, well, thank you, David. I've really enjoyed it. Yes, you're right. I could talk about this for a long time. I think that we have seen a good evolution of the industry, but I'm looking forward to the next 5 years. I think we're going to see a radical change in the next 5 years. So yeah, I've really enjoyed talking about it. So thank you, David.
Well, we'll no doubt find an opportunity to come back and have another chat. But for now, thank you very much indeed. The Today's Wills and Probate podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todayswillsandprobate.co.uk. My thanks to Tim. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.
You're listening to the Today's Wills and Probate podcast, one of the leading sources of information for the wills and probate sector. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todayswillsandprobate.co.uk and follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.